Hi, friends. Welcome back to True Crime Echoes. Today, we're diving into a story that isn't about a single crime scene or one infamous criminal. This is a story that stretches across decades, across countries, and into millions of lives. It's the story of a drug that started out as a medical miracle and turned into one of the deadliest epidemics of our time. If you've watched the news in the past few years, you've heard the word fentanyl. Maybe you've lost someone to it. Maybe you've brushed it off as just another drug headline. But the truth is, fentanyl didn't just appear out of nowhere. It has a history, a dark one, and that history explains why we are where we are today. So settle in, because we're going to peel back the layers, the science, the greed, the tragedy, and the humanity behind the fentanyl crisis. This isn't just history, it's a warning. Chapter 1. A Personal Beginning. Last year, I went in for surgery on my nose. For years, ever since high school, it had been broken in two different spots, and I never really realized just how much I was missing out on the simple act of breathing properly. When the doctors finally fixed it, I remember waking up in that sterile hospital room, still groggy, and a nurse leaned over and said, "We're going to give you something for the pain." I asked, half asleep. "What is it?" The answer hit me like a cold wave: fentanyl. Now, my first reaction was panic, because the only thing I knew about fentanyl at that point was death. Every headline I'd seen screamed about overdoses, about lives cut short. To me, fentanyl was the drug that killed people on the streets, not something that a doctor would calmly inject into my IV. For a moment, I thought this could be it. But then, within seconds, I felt the relief. The pain melted away like ice under the sun. And in that strange moment, I understood why this drug had such a grip on the world. It worked. It worked almost too well. That's when I started asking myself questions I couldn't shake off. Why did it feel like fentanyl had suddenly appeared out of nowhere in the last few years, when in reality it had been quietly sitting in hospital cabinets for decades? Who created it? And what was it originally meant for? How did something born out of medicine, something designed to help turn into the most powerful and deadly drug in modern history? And maybe the hardest question of all, why has it become a problem so big that it feels unstoppable? The truth is, I couldn't just leave those questions hanging, because since 2020, I've personally known 7 people who died from fentanyl overdoses. 7. And that's only me. When I talk to others, I hear the same thing: a cousin, a neighbor, a friend from school. It feels like everyone has a story. Everyone has been touched by it in some way. So today, I want to take you on that journey with me. To look back not just at the tragic headlines we've grown numb to, but at the roots. At how a Belgian scientist with the best of intentions, America's hunger for stronger medicine, and the deep pockets of big pharmaceutical companies all came together to create what would become the deadliest epidemic of our time. This is the dark history of fentanyl. Chapter 2: The Scientist Behind the Drug. To understand how fentanyl even came into existence, we have to go back far away from the headlines and the crises we know today, to Belgium in the 1920s. That's where a boy named Paul Janssen was born. Paul grew up in a world shadowed by sickness. When he was still a child, tragedy struck his family. His younger sister died of tuberculosis at just 4 years old, and that loss stayed with him. It's easy to imagine the weight of that kind of grief on a child, the guilt, the helplessness. Paul carried it with him, and in many ways it lit the path he would follow. He decided that if medicine could not save his sister, maybe it could save others. He worked relentlessly, pushing past financial struggles and personal setbacks until he built something most young doctors could only dream of: a research lab of his own. He called it Janssen Pharmaceutica. His mission was focused and personal pain management. He wanted to create medications that would stop suffering in its tracks. At the time, doctors really only had 2 main tools for serious pain relief: morphine and a drug called meperidine. Both worked, but they weren't perfect. Patients often needed high doses, and the relief wasn't always fast enough. For someone in agony, every second feels like a lifetime. Paul was convinced there had to be a better way. Inside his lab, he and his team started experimenting with chemical structures. Without diving too deep into the science, they discovered something crucial. Both morphine and meperidine shared a unique chemical feature, a kind of ring in their structure. That ring, they realized, was the key to pain relief. Paul's idea was simple but revolutionary. If he could take that core structure and improve on it, maybe he could create a painkiller that worked faster, lasted longer, and required smaller doses. Years of trial and error followed. Between 1953 and 1957, his lab came closer and closer. Their first breakthrough was a drug called phenoparidine, stronger than morphine, faster acting, and incredibly effective. But Paul wasn't satisfied. To him, good wasn't good enough. He believed he could create something even more powerful. And in 1960, he did. Paul and his team created a new compound unlike anything the medical world had seen before. It was potent, so potent that it outshined every painkiller that came before it. They named it fentanyl. In that moment, Paul Janssen must have felt like he'd accomplished something extraordinary, maybe even noble. A drug that could ease the kind of suffering he had witnessed as a child. A drug that could make unbearable pain disappear in seconds. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his creation would one day slip out of the sterile walls of the operating room and into the streets. That it would kill not thousands, but hundreds of thousands. That fentanyl would become a word synonymous not with healing, but with death. But in 1960, all Paul saw was hope. Chapter 3. The Deal with Johnson & Johnson. When Paul Janssen unveiled fentanyl in 1960, it was groundbreaking. Doctors were amazed by how fast it worked and how little of it was needed compared to morphine. In a medical setting, it felt like a miracle. But if there's one thing history has shown us, it's that a miracle drug doesn't stay a secret for long, especially when there's money to be made. Enter Johnson & Johnson. You probably know their name from everyday products, baby powder, Band-Aids, shampoo. They've been in almost every household for decades. But Johnson & Johnson also has a long history in pharmaceuticals. And when they saw what Paul had created, they saw more than a medical breakthrough. They saw dollar signs. Within a year, Johnson & Johnson acquired Janssen Pharmaceutica, and with it the rights to fentanyl. Suddenly, Paul's little lab in Belgium wasn't just a local research hub anymore. It was the engine behind Big Pharma's newest star drug. But not everyone was convinced this was a good thing. There was one man in particular who stood in the way, Dr. Robert Drips, a professor of anesthesiology in the United States. And ironically, with a name like Drips, you might expect him to sound like a comic book villain. But in this story, he was more of a reluctant hero. Dr. Drips took one look at fentanyl and didn't see a miracle. He saw a red flag. To him, fentanyl was simply too strong. It worked fast, yes, but it also had the potential to hook people, to overwhelm the body in dangerous ways. He warned the FDA directly if this drug were approved without strict limits, it could create an addiction crisis, the likes of which America had never seen. Think about that for a second. This was the 1960s, decades before the opioid epidemic we talk about today. And here was a doctor already predicting it, already sounding the alarm. The compromise that followed says a lot about how medicine and business collide. The FDA eventually approved fentanyl in 1968, but only in an extremely diluted form. The idea was that by watering it down 50-1, the high would be less enjoyable and therefore less addictive. On paper, it looked like a reasonable safeguard, but here's the problem. With safeguards in medicine, they only work as long as everyone respects them. And in the world of pharmaceuticals, respect often takes a backseat to profit. Within just a few years, those promises to keep fentanyl tightly controlled began to loosen. Restrictions were lifted, more concentrated forms slipped through, and hospitals started adopting fentanyl widely. It was efficient, reliable, and cheaper than alternatives. For surgeons and anesthesiologists, it became the new go-to. Paul Janssen must have felt vindicated. His drug was saving lives, easing pain, changing medicine. But Dr. Drips's warnings linger like a ghost in this story. He saw something others refused to see. He knew the same strength that made fentanyl valuable could also make it deadly if it ever left the walls of the hospital. And as history would prove, he was right. Chapter 4. from the operating room to the living room. By the early 1970s, fentanyl had firmly secured its place in hospitals. Surgeons loved it. Patients went under faster, stayed under longer, and woke up with less pain. To the medical community, it looked like the perfect tool. But medicine has a way of creeping outside the boundaries where it was first intended, and fentanyl was no exception. When Janssen's patent expired in 1981, the floodgates opened. Suddenly, other pharmaceutical companies could jump in and make their own versions. Competition meant new forms, new packaging, and new ways of selling fentanyl. And before long, this wasn't just a drug you got in an IV during surgery. It was being reimagined into things that felt almost ordinary. Take the fentanyl patch, for example. It worked a lot like a nicotine patch, a small square that stuck to the skin, slowly releasing the drug into the body. For cancer patients dealing with relentless pain, this was revolutionary. They didn't have to swallow pills every few hours or suffer through unbearable nights. Relief could be steady and lasting. But there was a catch. For people who had never been on opioids before, the patch could be deadly. It slowed their breathing to dangerous levels, sometimes to the point of no return. Doctors knew this, but as always, the line between careful use and careless use began to blur. And then came the most surreal invention of all fentanyl lollipops. Yes, lollipops. Marketed under names like Oralet and later Actic. These sugary sticks weren't for kids at the candy store. They were meant for children and adults going into surgery or for cancer patients in extreme pain. The idea was simple: suck on the lollipop, and in minutes you'd be calm, sedated, and ready for whatever was next. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it was a chilling symbol of just how far this drug had traveled from its origins. Think about it: a substance powerful enough to knock out an elephant, repackaged into something that looked like a treat. By the late 1990s, the FDA approved these lollipops for use at home in cancer patients. And that moment was pivotal. For the first time, fentanyl had officially crossed the threshold from the hospital into the living room, from the controlled hands of anesthesiologists into medicine cabinets across America. What started as a scientific breakthrough in a Belgian lab was now something you could unwrap and hold in your hand, something disguised as harmless candy, something so powerful that just a tiny miscalculation could mean life or death. Looking back, it feels like the point where the story should have stopped, where someone should have said, "This is far enough. This is too much." But of course, it didn't stop. It was only the beginning. Chapter 5: A Stronger Monster and the Black Market. If fentanyl itself wasn't already powerful enough, what came next feels almost unthinkable. Because Paul Janssen and his team weren't done experimenting. They wanted something stronger, something even more effective. And what they ended up creating wasn't just for humans at all, it was for animals. That new version was called carfentanil. Now, to put this into perspective, regular fentanyl is already 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. But carfentanil, it's on an entirely different level. This drug was designed to tranquilize massive animals, hippos, rhinos, even elephants. A few grains of it could drop a creature that weighed several tons. The terrifying part is that the lethal dose for a human isn't measured in grams or even hundreds of milligrams. Just 2 milligrams of fentanyl, barely enough to cover Abraham Lincoln's chin, on a penny can kill an adult. Carfentanil makes that seem almost modest. It's so concentrated that even handling it without proper protection can be fatal. And here's where things start to spiral out of control. Once fentanyl and its derivatives left the sterile safety of hospitals, they began slipping into the hands of people who weren't doctors or patients. By the early 2000s, a black market had formed. Dealers quickly realized how cheap fentanyl was to produce compared to other drugs, and how little of it was needed to create an intense high. It became a perfect filler. Pills that looked like prescription oxycodone laced with fentanyl, bags of heroin cut with fentanyl, even cocaine and MDMA started being mixed with it. Most users didn't even know what they were taking. They thought they were buying one drug, when in reality they were playing Russian roulette with a substance that could kill them in seconds. And of course, once the demand was there, supply followed. Cartels saw an opportunity. In countries like Mexico, India, and China, factories began producing the chemical ingredients needed to make fentanyl so-called precursors. These chemicals were legal on paper, but in the wrong hands, they became the building blocks of an illegal empire. The result was devastating. Fatal overdoses started to climb rapidly. By 2005, the FDA was already issuing warnings trying to tell the public just how dangerous this drug was. But warnings didn't slow anything down. If anything, the notoriety only made fentanyl more appealing to some users. Stronger, deadlier, it became almost legendary on the streets. In the years that followed, overdoses would skyrocket into the thousands. Families across America began losing loved ones to a drug most of them had never even heard of. It's chilling to think about. A drug born out of a desire to ease suffering was now fueling it, leaving a trail of funerals in its wake. And it was only going to get worse. Because fentanyl wasn't just a hospital medication anymore. It was a street drug. And once it hit the streets, it became unstoppable. Chapter 6: An Epidemic. Too big to ignore. By the time the 2010s rolled around, fentanyl was no longer a whisper in the shadows. It was everywhere. What had once been tucked inside hospital cabinets was now spilling into neighborhoods, high schools, and nightclubs. Starting around 2013, shipments of precursor chemicals were flowing in from Mexico, India, and China at an alarming rate. Cartels had perfected the process: import the ingredients, cook up fentanyl in secret labs, then press it into counterfeit pills or mix it into powders. To the naked eye, the pills looked exactly like oxycodone or Xanax. The bags of powder looked like heroin or cocaine, but inside they carried a deadly surprise. That's what made it so dangerous. Most people didn't even know they were taking fentanyl. They thought they were taking a pill to relax or a hit of something familiar. But this wasn't familiar. It was playing with death, and the deaths began to multiply. Fast. By 2016, fentanyl overdoses were making national headlines. Thousands of young people across the country were dying after swallowing or snorting what they believed were harmless party drugs. Parents would find their teenagers collapsed in bedrooms. Friends would watch someone take one pill at a party and never wake up again. For me, that year marked the moment it stopped feeling like an isolated tragedy and became something much bigger. Because in April of 2016, the world lost someone whose name everyone knew: Prince. The iconic musician was found unresponsive at his home in Minnesota. At first, the details were hazy, but soon it was revealed that Prince had died from an accidental fentanyl overdose. He thought he was taking Vicodin, a prescription painkiller. Instead, he'd been given counterfeit pills laced with fentanyl. It was a shockwave. If fentanyl could take down Prince, someone with fame, money, and access to the best care, then who was safe? The truth was no one. And the tragedy didn't stop there. Just 2 years later, in 2018, rapper Mac Miller was found dead at only 26. He too had unknowingly taken counterfeit oxycodone pills that were laced with fentanyl. His death was another gut punch to an entire generation that had grown up with his music. These high-profile losses forced fentanyl into the spotlight. News anchors started talking about it. Parents started warning their kids. But awareness didn't stop the deaths. In fact, the numbers only climbed higher. By the mid-2010s, the epidemic had grown so massive that experts compared the annual death toll to the casualties of war. One official said, "We've lost as many people in a single year to overdoses as we did in the entire Vietnam War." Think about that for a second. An entire war condensed into 1 year of overdoses. The slow drip that Dr. Robert Drips warned about back in the 1960s wasn't a drip anymore. It was a flood, and it was drowning America. The crisis had become too big to ignore. But the question was, could it ever be stopped? Chapter 7: Fighting Back. By the late 2010s, fentanyl wasn't just a problem, it was the problem. Families were burying loved ones, communities were being torn apart, and law enforcement couldn't keep up with the flood of pills and powders pouring into the country. Something had to give. In 2019, China announced it would begin tightening control over fentanyl. They restricted online sales, imposed new shipping regulations, and even created special task forces to investigate traffickers. On paper, it sounded like progress. But by that point, fentanyl was already firmly embedded in the U.S. drug supply. Even if one pipeline slowed down, countless others were still wide open. Here in the United States, officials tried their own strategies. Under President Biden, the Department of Health and Human Services rolled out what they called an overdose prevention strategy. The idea was to focus not only on cracking down but also on prevention and treatment. They put funding into opioid treatment programs and expanded the workforce dedicated to overdose response. But let's be honest, it's one thing to write a strategy on paper and another to actually stop the bleeding. Fentanyl was cheap, easy to smuggle, and devastatingly addictive. Trying to shut it down was like trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. Still, some tools did make a difference. One of them was the introduction of fentanyl test strips. They're simple. You dip the strip into a substance, and it tells you if fentanyl is present. The idea is that people who are going to use drugs anyway could at least test them first, and maybe avoid an accidental overdose. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a lifeline. And then there's Narcan, or naloxone. This drug has been nothing short of a miracle. Administered as a nasal spray or injection, Narcan can actually reverse an opioid overdose in progress. Someone who's stopped breathing, someone whose lips are turning blue, can come back within minutes if Narcan is given in time. It's not dramatic to say it literally brings people back from the brink of death. Today, in most states, you don't even need a prescription to get Narcan. Pharmacies carry it, and community health organizations hand it out for free. I keep a box in my own home even though I don't use drugs. Why? Because I know how unpredictable life is, and I'd rather have it and never need it than need it and not have it. But here's the thing. Narcan and test strips don't solve the root of the problem. They're Band-Aids. They save lives in the moment, and that's crucial, but they don't stop fentanyl from flooding the streets. They don't erase the fact that nearly 110,000 Americans die from drug overdoses each year with fentanyl at the center of it all. By the early 2020s, it was clear that this wasn't going away. If anything, it was getting worse. The DEA seized nearly 80 million fentanyl pills in 2023 alone, enough deadly doses to kill every single person in the United States. Think about that. 1 year, one haul, enough poison to wipe out an entire country. So yes, there are efforts to fight back. There are victories, and there are lives saved every day because of Narcan, because of awareness campaigns, because of people who refuse to give up on their loved ones. But the bigger war, the one against the supply chains, the cartels, the profit-driven pharmaceutical industry that set all of this in motion, that's still being fought. And right now, it's a war we're not winning. Chapter 8. Who's to blame? At this point in the story, the question almost asks itself, who's responsible for all of this? Who let fentanyl slip from a hospital miracle into a street-level catastrophe? Some people point straight at Big Pharma. And honestly, it's hard not to. Johnson & Johnson and other pharmaceutical giants had every opportunity to keep fentanyl tightly controlled. Instead, they marketed it, expanded it, repackaged it, and pushed it out further and further. Lollipops, patches, nasal sprays. Every new version made it easier for fentanyl to spread and easier for abuse to follow. But maybe it isn't that simple. Because if we're being honest, the drug problem in America didn't start and end with corporations. There's something bigger going on. In the 1960s, Dr. Robert Dripps warned that fentanyl could create an addiction crisis if it left the operating room. He wasn't wrong, but what he couldn't have predicted was the perfect storm that would hit decades later, economic despair, isolation communities struggling to find hope, and a culture that treats quick fixes like answers. Addiction doesn't come out of nowhere. It thrives where people are hurting. And let's face it, America has a lot of pain. Some people say, well, they shouldn't have been using drugs in the first place. And I get that reaction. It's easy to blame the individual. But here's the truth, addiction is not a moral failure. It's not about being weak or irresponsible. Addiction is a disease. It's a mental health disorder. Genetics can load the gun, but society and circumstance pull the trigger. I've seen it up close. Friends who were good people, smart people, people with dreams, they tried something once, or they relied on a pill to get through the day, and suddenly, they weren't the same anymore. Addiction took hold, and it didn't let go. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, famous or unknown, young or old. So who's to blame Big Pharma, yes, for unleashing this drug without enough safeguards? The government, too, for failing to listen when the warnings first came. But also, we can't ignore the environment. We've created a culture that looks away when people struggle, that stigmatizes addicts instead of helping them, that profits from pain until it's too late. Fentanyl didn't just happen. It's the result of choices, greed, and neglect. And while it's easy to point fingers, the reality is that this problem belongs to all of us now. Chapter 9: The Human Cost. When we talk about fentanyl, it's easy to get lost in the numbers. Tens of thousands of deaths every year. Nearly 645,000 people lost to opioids and fentanyl between 1999 and 2021. Charts, graphs, statistics, they tell part of the story. But behind every single number is a person, a son, a daughter, a best friend, a parent, someone with plans, with memories, with people who loved them. I think about the families left behind, the parents who walk past an empty bedroom every day, the siblings who carry guilt for not noticing the warning signs, the friends who replay the last text they sent, wishing they had said more. Addiction doesn't just destroy the person caught in it. It ripples outward, pulling entire families into grief that never really ends. And the cruelest part is how sudden it can be. With fentanyl, there is no second chance. One pill, one line, one mistake, and it's over. You don't get to learn from it. You don't get to recover. You don't get to grow older and look back. It takes you before you even realize what's happened. That's why it feels so urgent to talk about it, not in whispers, not as some shameful secret, but out loud. Because fentanyl doesn't care about stigma. It doesn't care if you judge or if you look away. It will keep killing quietly and quickly until we start treating addiction as what it truly is, an illness. A crisis that deserves empathy, not condemnation. I've lost people I cared about, and maybe you have too. Or maybe you will if this epidemic continues the way it's going. That's what scares me. The thought that one day you'll be sitting where I am telling your own story about a friend you buried, or a sibling you couldn't save, and I don't want that for you. I don't want that for anyone. Because this isn't just a drug story, it's a human story. Chapter 10: Closing Reflections. So here we are at the end of this story. We've walked through decades of science profit warnings ignored and lives lost. And honestly, it's a lot to carry. It's heavy. When fentanyl first entered the world, it was meant to heal. Paul Jansen dreamed of easing pain, not creating it. But somewhere along the way, the line blurred. Hospitals gave way to corporations. Corporations gave way to greed, and greed opened the door to something that can no longer be contained. And now we're left with the reality: fentanyl isn't just a headline or a statistic or a far-off crisis. It's here. It's in our communities, our schools, our families. And it doesn't care who you are. But if there's one thing I hope you take away from this story, it's that addiction doesn't make someone worthless. It doesn't mean they're weak or broken beyond repair. Addiction is an illness, and people deserve help, not judgment. If you or someone you love is struggling, there are resources out there. Hotlines, treatment centers, support groups. And if picking up the phone feels impossible, sometimes just talking to someone you trust can be the first step. You are not alone. I'll be honest, I don't want to go to any more funerals because of fentanyl. I don't want to watch more families break under the weight of something that could have been prevented. So please, if you take risks, test your substances. Carry Narcan if you can. And more than anything, take care of yourself. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. I know it wasn't easy, but it was necessary. These are the conversations that matter. Next time on True Crime Echoes, we're going to explore another case that left behind just as many questions as answers: the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. But until then, be safe, make good choices, and take care of each other. I'll see you soon. That's where we'll leave today's story. Fentanyl is more than just a drug. It's a reflection of how human ambition, corporate greed, and societal pain can combine to create a crisis that feels unstoppable. But history isn't just about what's behind us. It's also about what we do next. If you or someone you love is struggling with addiction, please know that help is out there. Addiction isn't weakness. It isn't failure. It's an illness, and there is support for you. I'll leave some resources in the description, and I encourage you to share them if you think they could help someone else. Thank you for spending this time with me on True Crime Echoes. I know it was a heavy topic, but I believe these are the stories that matter the most. If you found this episode meaningful, please consider subscribing, sharing it with a friend, or leaving a comment below. Your voice helps keep these conversations alive. And remember, be safe, take care of yourselves, and take care of each other. Until next time, I'll see you soon.